Forward together. Not one step back. Family, God bless you. God bless you. God bless you. We thank God this morning for waking us up and allowing us this space. I want to thank all of you, my great friends and allies in the SEIU House of Labor, to my sister beloved, President Mary Kay, to my brother Jerry Hudson and my brother George Gresham, who's been a brother beloved, to all of you whom, if I call every name, I would run out of time, to the more than 2 million members of SEIU and the global delegation from around the world. You have been my friends personally, to the North Carolina NAACP and to the Forward Together Moral Movement, and I greet you also this morning on behalf of repairers of the breach that's working with the Fight for 15 as we move across this nation. I'm so glad that Sister Carrie Jones and this convention has decided to move on the intersectionality between racial justice and economic justice. Because the truth is that whenever someone asks the question, is our challenge in this country race or class, we should simply say it is. The two are inextricably tied together. You cannot examine America without dealing with race and class. Dr. King in the 1960s said to a group just like this, together, we must exert massive pressure on the government to get jobs for all. Together we must form a grand alliance. Together we must merge all people for goodwill. Dr. King said it in 1961 and then again in 67. It might just be the only groups that can form the massive reconstruction of American society is a massive coalition of blacks, poor whites, progressive whites, working class folk, the recipients of welfare, Native Americans. This may be the only coalition, he said, that can shift America's economic architecture and make the profound changes necessary to care for all the people. Today, standing quite humbly in that tradition, I want to update Dr. King's assessment and say we must come together. In order to address the race and class connections, though we must understand, as President Mary Kay said, the depth of it. And in order to do that, we must understand the reconstruction and deconstruction periods of American history. The first reconstruction took place in the shadow of slavery, amid the wreckage of the Civil War beginning in 1865. African Americans joined hands with whites in the North and whites in the South who were willing to see them as allies. They came together and they set out to nurture what Abraham Lincoln had called a new birth of freedom and what Frederick Douglass had fought for and Harriet Tubman had fought for, and they formed something called fusion coalitions. In the 1800s, by 1868, 1870, all of the southern states were led by fusion coalitions. Black and whites came together, took over the state legislatures, rewrote constitutions, hammered out new constitutions, opened up citizenship for all people, built the first public schools, began to talk about labor rights, outlawed slavery, extended the ballot to all men regardless of color. Together, between 1868 and 1880s, they launched a brave experiment with a more expansive democracy, but in less than 5 years, it came under opposition. Many of the former Confederates saw black citizenship and black leadership working with white leadership as inherently illegitimate. They first started out by attacking whites that dared to work with African Americans, and then They attacked African American leaders and they killed black and white leaders. They assailed raising taxes because taxes, monies, and government monies were used to build public schools and to advance the democracy for all people. They took over the courts. They began to engage in voter suppression. The Tea Party, wrong century. Wrong century. They turned to violence, fraud, racial demagoguery. They claimed their mantra was, we must redeem America. We must take our country back. And they did so, and by 1896, they had violent riots. By 1898, you had Plessy versus Ferguson, and basically the first Reconstruction was over. And then a century later, we had the second Reconstruction. Black and whites and then Latinos together, Jews, Catholics, and Christians came together, fusion politics. 1954, the Brown decision that we just celebrated the anniversary of last week. Together, they came together. They integrated public schools in the South. They won the Civil Rights Act. They opened public accommodations to everyone. They passed the Voting Rights Act. They secured ballots for all Southerners, regardless of color. They embraced the war on poverty and raising the minimum wage. They embraced labor. This new fusion movement began to talk about equal rights for women. It lifted up a visionary leader called Dr. King, who talked about unarmed truth and unconstitutional love having the last word. He became now one of the real founding fathers of this nation. The second Reconstruction reinvigorated the words of the Declaration of Independence. But once again, some people didn't like that kind of coming together. They called themselves Dixiecrats. They were conservative extremists. They revolted against black citizenship. They saw it as too excessive, too many people being included. They turned to violence. They killed Martin and Medgar and Malcolm and Viola Woosa. They beat Fannie Lou Hamer. They killed 4 little girls in a Birmingham church. Then they launched something called the Southern Strategy because they wanted a so-called solid South. It was a backlash of re-entrenchment. They attacked black leaders. They began to rail against taxes. They began to talk about rolling back all of these excesses. They cut support for integrated public schools. They drained education dollars into private schools. They vowed again to take their country back. They chopped at the changes that they called social engineering. They began to go after the courts, and they developed a code language for race. Lee Atwater and Kevin Phillips explained the goal was to talk race without sounding race. So they created a new thesaurus that didn't use the N-word. Instead, they used phrases like tax cuts, entitlement reform, forced busing, law and order, states' rights, right to work states. This became the new code language for racialized politics. Then they attempted to narrow the moral categories, and they began to say that the only moral issues in the public square was anti-abortion, anti-gay, and pro-prayer in the school, and that addressing classism and racism and militarism were not moral issues, as Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel and so many others had said. Their goal was to blame black people and brown people for the nation's problem, to blackanize every program, the very programs that had lifted up many whites. They came against those. As soon as black and brown people all over the country began to have access, Kevin Phillips said that the key to winning is to find out who hates one another and turn them against each other. Kevin Phillips designed the strategy. George Wallace used the strategy. Richard Nixon won with the strategy. Ronald Reagan perfected the strategy, and the Koch brothers funded the strategy, and now Alec and the And now Alec and the extreme Tea Party are trying to put money and policy behind the strategy to extend the strategy. And for nearly 50 years, this strategy has been used to turn working class white people and black people in the Midwest, in the northern suburbs, and especially in the South against one another when we should be allies with one another to stand against. We should be allies with one another to stand against the powerful oligarchy who works against black, white, and brown poor people. And even though there are 8 million more poor white people than black people in this country, the goal has been to turn working class white people and poor people against black and brown people in a way that undermines white people even from building coalitions with black and brown people, and has caused many whites to vote against their own self-interest. How else do you explain that the majority of the counties in this country that are poor, especially in the South, are mostly white, but they're electing political representatives that are the most adverse and opposition to labor and economic justice policies? The question in this country is what trumps common sense? It's called structural systemic racism and the white Southern strategy. And that's why we make a mistake when we only consider racism to have shown itself when we catch somebody on tape using the N-word, or when they fly a Confederate flag, as bad as it is. The fact of the matter, the governor of South Carolina has proven you can take the flag down and still keep racism up. In fact, in some ways, taking that flag down was racist, because the flag didn't come down through the NAACP boycott. The governor said, now that 9 people have died, I'm going to take the flag down. What? You mean black lives really don't matter, only black death matters? And it takes 9 deaths for you to bring down a flag of a war that was lost 150 years ago? That's racism. When you bring the flag down, but one of the men that died, Reverend Pickney, died, he was fighting for funding for education. He was fighting for a living wage. He was fighting for Medicaid expansion. So you bring the flag down so you can cover up that you won't vote Medicaid expansion up and vote living wages up and vote voter protection up. So we have to penetrate, tell your neighbor, penetrate the racist fall, because there's a book entitled, Today We Have Racism with No Racists. And yet Glenn Lowry says in almost every observable measure of well-being, wages, unemployment, income, prison enrollment, crime victimization, health, mortality statistics, we see the disparate treatment. He said there are no racists in terms of using racial language. And yet this same author says only the will for death cannot hear the dog whistle politics of calling President Obama, for instance, a food stamp president, or gutting the Voting Rights Act, or blocking Medicaid in the states where 6 out of 10 of black people live, even though in those same states there are more white people being denied Medicaid expansion than black. But you make Medicaid expansion sound like something that's just going to help black and brown people who you deem are lazy and poor, as though poverty is a glorified vacation rather than a result of economic exploitation. Dog whistle politics, camouflage race baiting and labor-hating politicians use strategies to control. And that's why they're after the 11 southern states. They want that southern strategy to stay in place. Because when you can control 11 southern states, you can control 22 Senate seats in the United States Congress, which means you only need 4 to have a majority from the other 39 states. If you control 11 southern states, you control 131 House seats. That's 31% of the United States House, which means you only need 19 to 20% out of the other 39 states to have a majority. If you can control 11 states, you control 11 governors that control 11 boards of election. If you can control 11 states, you can control 11 state houses that keep voting right to work, so-called right to work laws in that impact working people. In other words, the Southern strategy, unchallenged, allows a stranglehold against racial justice and economic justice, and it holds the nation hostage. And in this strategy, that's what's behind voter suppression laws we see right now. All of the voter suppression laws, the worst coming out of North Carolina, but all of them are in the states where there has been a high black voter turnout, and the potential for fusion politics between white, black, and brown people. The strategy behind the 5-4 Shelby decision and the refusal of the extremist leadership of the United States Congress for more than 1,000 days, that's 1,000 days longer than Strom Thurmond filibustered the Civil Rights Act of 1957, they have held up fixing the Voting Rights Act. Why? Because they know the power of us coming together. And despite the fact that there is this refusal, there's been this refusal to own racism, we see race baiting and labor hating in this strategy of extremism. Do you know that the U.S. Attorney General today has less power to deal with voting rights attack than the U.S. Attorney General had in 1965, 51 years ago after Selma to Montgomery? That is why labor rights and the fight for voting rights, we must see them as united. Voting rights is not just a black issue. To attack voting rights is to attack labor rights, is to attack living wages, is to attack health care. It is to undermine our democracy. That is why we must have a grown-up conversation about race and class, because at the very time that we have more potential, for instance, in the South and in the Midwest and in the Rust Belt, to break open the solid South, to break open this extremism, to dismantle the Southern strategy, at a time when if you just register 30% of the unregistered black and brown voters, for instance, in the South, and they vote 60% and build coalition with progressive whites around an anti-racism, anti-poverty, pro-labor, pro-justice agenda, we can break the stranglehold of the Southern strategy and free the nation. At the very time, movements like the Fight for 15 and Moral Monday and the NAACP and SEIU and Black Lives Matter represent the possibility for a third Reconstruction, we are seeing the greatest attacks on voting rights and labor rights happen simultaneously. And my friends, it is not our weakness they fear, it is our strength. That's right, unstoppable. This is why, for instance, we've seen in North Carolina and other places, but in North Carolina in particular, a so-called bathroom bill that's not about bathroom bills. Inside the bill is a prohibition against raising the minimum wage and paying sick leave and paying vacation leave and having minorities set aside. Inside that same bill is a policy to end the ability of employment discrimination claims in the state court. Bathroom is the scapegoat. LGBT is the scapegoat. It is an anti-civil rights, anti-living wage, anti-labor, anti-gay, all in one bill. But the reason is because the goal of the Southern strategy is to stir race, class, and sexual fear in an effort to use race baiting, labor hating, and gay bashing in order to stir up an extreme coalition to vote against America's future. The same groups that stir immigration fear are against labor. The same groups that are against voting rights are against labor. The same groups that participate in xenophobia and Islamophobia are against labor, because they see the power of us coming together and changing this country and moving it forward. Now, as I conclude, this is what they are saying. They are trying to sell this at the ballot box. If you want America to be great, the pathway to greatness is to attack labor, to attack public education and school teachers, to deny living wages. If you really want to be great, deny health care. If you really want to be great, deny LGBT rights, deny immigrants' rights, turn to hate and fear, deny voting rights, and if you really want to be great, make sure everybody can get a gun quicker than they can vote. And we must say if they are cynical and extreme enough to believe that and be together, we must be smart enough and wise enough to come together and know that we are all in this battle together. It's time. It's time. It is time, my friends. It is time to fulfill the dream of an anti-racism, pro-labor, anti-hate, pro-justice, third Reconstruction. If we are serious about racial justice and economic justice, we must come together right now around an intersectional agenda. What would it look like? Number one, we demand that we secure pro-labor, anti-poverty policies that ensure economic sustainability by fighting for full employment, living wages, the alleviation of disparate unemployment, support for affirmative action, a green economy, labor rights, affordable housing, targeted empowerment zone, strong safety nets for the poor, fair policies for immigrants, critiquing war policies that further disable our ability to have a real war on poverty, infrastructure development, and fair tax reform for working people. Number two, educational equality by ensuring that every child receives a high-quality, well-funded, constitutional, diverse public education, regardless of their race or their class, with access to community colleges and universities. Number three, health care for all, by starting with access to the Affordable Care Act, but eventually getting to universal health care, protecting Medicaid, protecting Medicare, protecting Social Security, protecting the environment, and ensuring that women have a right to their own health care and their own treatment. Number four, if we want this democracy to move forward, we must demand fairness in the criminal justice system by addressing the continuing inequalities in the system for black people and brown people and poor white people, and we must fight against the proliferation of guns in our community. And number five, if we want a great democracy, we must protect and expand voting rights and civil rights and women's rights and LGBTQ rights and labor rights and immigrant rights. And we must say that the most important principle of this democracy is equal protection under the law for everybody. And we must use Jerry and Mary and George and Carrie. We must use moral language to frame and critique racist and anti-economic justice policy, regardless of who's in power. This is not about just one election. This is about whether we will elect to take America forward. We must declare that some things are not about left versus right. That comes out of the French Revolution. We're in the 21st century, the whole left versus right construct. Some things are not Democrat versus Republican. Some things are not conservative versus liberal, because I'm both. I'm conservative with ketchup and liberal with hot sauce. That's just how I am. So we need new language. Some things are just wrong. Some things are just immoral. Some things are just wrong, and we must remember our Constitution says establishment of justice. That's not Democrat or Republican, that's just constitutional morality. Our deepest religious faith says let justice roll down like water. Our deepest religious faith says love must be supreme. Our deepest religious faith says caring for the least of these must be at the center of our public policy. And if that's true, and I know it is, then racism is just wrong and immoral. Economic injustice is just immoral. Hate is just wrong and immoral. It's morally indefensible, it's constitutionally inconsistent, and it's economically insane. So it's just wrong. And somewhere, black, brown, yellow, red, and white, we must come together for what is right. Let me be a preacher for 2 seconds. Last week, 2 Sundays ago, was Pentecost. In my faith tradition, Pentecost is when scattered disciples that were being beat up by an oppressive government, male and female, of different races. Their leader had been crucified, and they were trying to shut them down. They were trying to shut down the movement. Rome was. But then those disciples, male and female, all different races, they came together in an upper room on the second floor, and something happened. They got power to fight on anyhow. We call it Pentecost. We call it moral power. It made them unstoppable. A new wind began to blow. The fire of justice began to inspire them. They started speaking in other tongues, the tongues of love and the tongues of justice. I just got a question. Could it be that here in Cobo Hall on the second floor, it's time for us to lead America to a political, social, and labor and racial Pentecost? Pentecost. Could it be time? Could it be time for a Pentecost? Could it be that if Mara Monday and the Fight for 15 get together? Could it be if SEIU and labor, the NAACP and civil rights gets together? Could it be that when we come together, a Pentecost will come? A racial and a labor Pentecost. Could it be that some new wind is blowing? Could it be that some new fire is burning? Could it be that it's time to speak in a new tongue? Could it be that when we all come together, we can save the soul of this democracy? I feel the spirit in this room. I feel power, power, power in this room when we all come together. 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 What a day! 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 What a day!